April 1993, Formula 1 witnessed one of the great wet weather drives, and if you ever see a list video or just a list page on a website, this one typically ends up near the top. I also appreciate that I'm a bit late for the anniversary here, but there were other videos on the to-do list that I wanted to get out of the way first. Anyway, today's video is about the 1993 European Grand Prix. Senna's Sunday drive, if you will. The race is famous for two things. One we've just established, the other is that it was held at the Donington Park circuit in the East Midlands. And if you were to assign a home circuit to me, it would be this one. It's about 45 minutes away. It's actually showing slightly longer to get there on Apple Maps because there's been an accident on the M6. Again. But it's a track I've been to for realsies, and it is as fun as it looks. But the thing is, Donington wasn't the first choice for a race in 1993. Bernie and Formula 1 wanted the race to be in Japan instead at the Autopolis circuit, a track that had opened 3 years prior and was looking to host major international events such as kart and Formula 1. But the circuit had run into major money troubles and the company that owned the track had filed for bankruptcy. It did host one major series though, the final round of the 1991 World Sports Car Championship, which was won by a car driven by two blokes who are now on the Formula 1 grid, Michael Schumacher and Carl Wendlinger. The circuit had sponsored the Benetton team through 1990 and 1991 to make people aware that the circuit existed, but on top of going bust, people who visited Autopolis were critical of its remoteness. Japan would get a second race for 1994 and 1995 when it visited the AIDA circuit. So Donington was put into Autopolis' slot for the race to be held on the 11th of April 1993, and would use the full Grand Prix loop that was added to the circuit in 1985 so that bikes could be raced on it. It bumped the circuit distance up from 1.9 miles to 2.4 miles, and without it the F1 cars would be going sub 1 minute without even trying. The Grand Prix loop is just a chicane that goes the other way and two Mickey Mouse hairpins that are a complete pain. I mean, I don't like them anyway. And Senna had spoken up about the nature of the track. He said it was short, lacked straights and was quite narrow. It really wasn't a Formula 1 circuit even back then, let alone now, and mentioned something about controversies with overtaking. I think he meant it was likely that some drivers might try something silly to make up positions on a track that might have been nigh on impossible to overtake at. I mean, we saw what happened at Melbourne the other week with drivers taking risks. But this is 1993, so no prizes for guessing which two cars locked out the front row of the grid. Correct, it was the two Williams cars with the highly advanced FW15C, a car that had yes on it. Active suspension, automatic gearbox, anti-lock brakes, traction control, blown diffuser. It was, in terms of onboard gizmos, driver aids specifically, the most advanced Formula 1 car ever built. In 1993. None of that on an F1 car today. Well, they have flappy paddle seamless shift gearboxes, but at least the driver is doing it. The TLDR is that FW15C around Donington Park should have been unstoppable. And Senna had his work cut out before the race had even begun. Just on one lap pace, Prost was 1.5 seconds faster than the McLaren. But the second qualifying session, of which there were two back then, one on Friday, one on Saturday, was in the dry. The weather on Sunday for the race was a bit British. I mean, what do you expect? It was April. Wikipedia's article for the race says the weather that day was very cold, rain with dry spells. Very cold being, well, I don't know, it says that it's about 9 degrees outside, but then again it's only about, what, 8:45, so I'm guessing it would have been about the same then. 10 degrees, something like that. So Senna was fourth on the grid. Schumacher, Hill and Prost were ahead, and on race morning it chucked it down and a fog rolled in. The rain had stopped just before the start of the race, and Senna knew that this would help him against the two Williams cars. Rain is the great equaliser after all. Now at this point you might be saying, hang on Aiden, you've told us 100 times before that the most amount of drivers that can start a Grand Prix is 26, and the 107% rule wasn't brought in until 1996, so why hasn't Badoa qualified? Good question, and I had to do some research into this myself. After Brabham folded midway through the 1992 season, pre-qualifying had no reason to exist anymore, so you just had the maximum of 30 cars whittled down to 26 for the race, as it would be on the Friday and the Saturday. Now, with only 26 cars entered in the 1993 season, you'd assume that it would be so long as you set a lap, you were in the race. But the FIA initially said only 24 cars would start a race. But at the urging of some of the back of the grid teams, the FIA said, okay, we'll up it to 25, so every team would have at least one car on the grid. The problem was that the bottom two cars at every race, except for the Brazilian Grand Prix where it was one of the Jordans, the bottom two drivers were either Badoa or Alboreto in the Scuderia Italia cars. So at the German Grand Prix, the FIA just said, Yeah, whatever, all 26 of you can race so long as you've set a lap. At the start of the Grand Prix, everybody got away cleanly, and by cleanly, nobody crashed, at least up to turn 1. Schumacher blocked Senna, and by the time they entered Redgate, Senna was 5th behind Wendlinger, who had got ahead of Schumacher. Senna had got past Schumacher by the time they reached Hollywood, and then nabbed 3rd from Wendlinger into the Craner curves as they headed down the hill. But as Senna went through past Wendlinger, Schumacher and Michael Andretti tried to do the same, and the Craners isn't exactly a prime overtaking point either. Schumacher managed to make it through, but as Andretti tried it, he hit Wendlinger and they were both out, meaning that Andretti, after 3 rounds of the F1 season at this point, had still yet to complete a racing lap. Hill was dealt with at McLean's, and Prost was dispatched at the first hairpin. But while Senna gets all the column inches because he'd gone from 4th down to 5th and then up to 1st in 1 lap, some recognition should be given to Rubens Barrichello, who was in his rookie season. Rubinho had started 12th on the grid, and by the end of the first lap he was in 4th, in a Jordan, and only 2 of those spots, as far as I can tell, were from drivers going off, Andretti and Wendlinger. The main problem the drivers had to deal with over the course of this race was that it was wet, then it dried out a bit, and then it rained again, and then it dried out again. It was that typical gamble of will the rain intensify or will it sort itself out, something we're very accustomed to seeing, and sometimes drivers get it wrong. 2021 Russian Grand Prix is a recent example. The drivers pitted around lap 18 for slicks because it had dried out enough. By the midpoint of the race, the leaders had made 3 pit stops, and on his 3rd trip through the pits, Senna had a slow stop and lost a lot of time. But while on slicks later in the race it started to rain again and Senna stayed out while the 2 Williams cars pitted. Prost stalled his car because his gearbox had been acting up and it sent him down to 4th and a lap down. Barrichello had been running 3rd until his car conked out and Prost was back on the podium. And then on lap 57, Senna set the fastest lap. I talked about how he did it in another video, but I'll tell it again for those who haven't seen that video. The way the pit lane was at Donington that year, well, it still is there, but I don't think it's actually used anymore, was a bit weird in that it shortcut a significant part of the final hairpin and spat you out into the national circuit pits. This, on top of the fact there were no speed limits in the pit lane in those days, meant that Senna could drive straight through for an abandoned stop without losing much time. It has to be said that in 1993 the FIA had been trialling speed limits in free practice to check their viability, but in the race, no speed limits. Go as fast as you want or can. So at Monza they'd be entering and leaving their pit boxes at speeds that would be unfathomable today. The race was pretty much settled at the end of that first lap. Senna won by nearly 90 seconds from Hill, who was the only other car on the same lap. Prost was 3rd after his troubles, while Johnny Herbert in the Lotus was 4th. Patrese, in the only Benetton to finish after Schumacher spun off, was in 5th, and Fabrizio Barbazza in the Minardi took 6th. 11 drivers were classified, with Alboreto and the Lola being the final finisher, albeit 6 laps behind the McLaren. Senna later told Brazilian TV, "It was a race like old times, going hard from the heart. I had to be smart over when to press the rhythm and when to hold back. It was a fantastic race. I'm happy for all of us, not just for me, but for the team and staff. It was a dream. God knows, and when he wants something, there is nothing that can stop it." The race has since entered racing folklore. Senna's dominant performance in an inferior McLaren against the all-conquering FW15C. But it might surprise you to find out that the McLaren and the Williams weren't that different after all. That MP48 had traction control, 2-way telemetry, semi-automatic or full automatic transmission, and active suspension, much like the Williams. But McLaren was a little bit behind in the development cycle. What was clear is that the Ford engine in the McLaren was down on power versus the Williams Renaults, and even the Fords in the Benettons, because Benetton had preferential treatment, at least until the British Grand Prix. Senna was able to extract every last little bit out of the car, because it seemed that aggressive drivers could get more out of these active cars than smoother drivers could, like Prost or Patrese. Senna was in contention for the title up until Portugal or something like that. It's a kind of a little bit of this, a little bit of that. The car wasn't exactly analog versus the digital Williams, but Senna still managed to work his magic. The race would end up being the only one at Donington Park. The circuit was supposed to replace Silverstone in around 2010, subject to circuit upgrades, but they never materialised, and Silverstone would renegotiate a deal to continue to host the British Grand Prix. Today, the circuit hosts national-level car racing and a couple of international bike races, but it remains the home of one of the top-level wet-weather drives, and also serves as a what-if. What if Donny had got the deal for 2010? So then, a look at Senna's wet weather cruise at Donington in 1993. If you've enjoyed this look back or maybe learned something from this, then do like the video, and for more like this, get subscribed with the bell on so you never miss out on a future video. Massive thanks as ever to the kind folk at Patreon for the support. If you want to help out with keeping things running, there is a link to Patreon in the description, along with my F1 Store affiliate link, Discord, and my socials. Well, there's super thanks if you just want to refill my coffee cup. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.